Hi everyone, thanks for joining today's webinar presentation, The Next Billion-Dollar Acquisition in Pharma, a forward-looking pattern analysis on Bristol Myers Squibb's acquisition of Celgene. I am William Mansfield, consultant at PatentSite. PatentSite is a LexisNexis company focused on strategic patent analytics. Let me cover a couple of things before we get started. Please feel free to raise questions during the webinar using the Q&A feature. You will also receive an email with a download link and a copy of the slides and an access to the recording after today's webinar. Now I would like to introduce today's presenters. Jean Quinn. Jean is the president and founder of IP Watchdog, a patent attorney, law professor, and a leading commentator on patent law and innovation policy. He was recently named one of the world's leading IP strategists by IAM. Joining Jean is Marco Richter and Kevin Noonan. Marco is head of consulting and customer success at LexisNexis PatentSite. He has a strong consulting background in patent analytics, providing insights in dozens of projects to Fortune 500 and DAX companies. Kevin is a partner with McDonald, Boner, Hulbert, and Berghoff LPP, and serves as chair of the firm's biotechnology and pharmaceuticals practice group. His practice involves all aspects of patent prosecution, interferences, and litigation. He is also one of the founding patent docs, which is considered by the ABA to be one of the top intellectual property blogs. And now I will hand over to Jean.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us here today and spending a portion of your Monday with us. I think we have a really interesting conversation in store for you here today. And let me just very briefly give you an idea of what I think is going to unfold here today. When we first started this webinar series and conceived of it, if you were on some of the early webinars, you'll remember that we didn't really have much of a PowerPoint or even any PowerPoint. We really wanted this to be a conversation. And that's what we have today. We will have some PowerPoint slides to facilitate that conversation. But the conversation we have in store today is a little bit different than what we've done in the past. We're going to look at the ramifications, I guess you might say, of the merger or potential merger between Bristol Myers Squibb and Celgene, and what the industry might look like once that merger goes through, what the antitrust regulators might be interested in questioning, and why some people are asking them to do so. And then maybe if we have some time, we might also look at what we can learn from some other mergers that have gone through recently. The one that might come up particularly might be the Dow and DuPont merger, which from several years ago. Now, I don't think any of us are antitrust experts, although we know it does play a big role. But increasingly what we're seeing is, and in particularly in Europe, we know for sure that antitrust regulators are specifically looking at patents in order to determine whether or not there is going to be a competitive landscape post-merger. And in America, the FTC and DOJ are being asked to do the same sort of thing. So that's why we thought that it would be interesting for us patent industry professionals to take a look at what is going on, what each of these two companies own and what they're good at and what they have some dominance in, and then what the collective company might have a lot of dominance in. So I'm really excited, and I'm glad Kevin was able to join us, and he was I know a late addition to the webinar, but I've known Kevin for a very long time, and he is going to add a lot of real great scientific insight and knowledge about the industry. So with that form of introduction, gentlemen, why don't we just jump in and get going. Marco, do you have a first slide prepared for us to kind of talk about and show to the audience?
Yeah, thank you, Gene. Yeah, matter of fact, as matter of entering the subject field here, the pharma industry, I would like to kick off today's conversation by just taking a general look at the pharma space, and in particular two players and their success in a particular field in order to establish a common ground for us all that basically will show us how patents are a good means to assess the positive or negative success of companies' R&D efforts. And let's just take a quick look at that very first slide,
Now,
which will
Marco,
show,
can I interrupt you for 1 second? What I do
Yeah.
want to do, and I know that I meant to do this during my introduction. For the slides that are being created here, Marco has used patent site in order to get the information here. Now, a lot of you might have questions about how does patent site come up with this information? Is it reliable? And it is reliable, and we spent an entire webinar going over and explaining where it comes from. And I'm going to send a link to that webinar to everybody right now in the chat box. And if you're not watching this on your computer, we can get that link to you before. So we're going to assume that the information here you understand to be reliable and not really go through and explain all the ins and outs of the information, so we can just cut right to the discussion. But there is the information if you are interested, and it's all perfectly vetted, and Patent Site is happy to answer any questions about that you may have. So I'm sorry, I meant to say that, Marco. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine, Gene. And maybe to sum things up for the audience, Patent Site is an analytical platform to evaluate patents and patent portfolios. And one of our core offerings is the Patent Asset Index, a way to evaluate patents and patent portfolios. And it's bundled with a very high data quality when it comes to the legal status information and the ownership information of patents, to ground laying aspects of patent analytics and being able to do proper patent analytics. Now, when we look at the graph shown here in the first slide, we're looking at the development of the patent strength of two big players in pharma, Pfizer and Roche, in particular in the area of Alzheimer's disease, or trying to cure Alzheimer's disease, right, with their efforts. And what you see here is an increase for both companies until 2008. And then as we look at the continued development and success rates of these companies through 2012, we see things shift quite a bit. So we see Roche on a continuous increase of successful R&D outputs, and we see Pfizer here losing traction, and whatever they're coming out of with their R&D is not as successful anymore. And also part that plays into this, they're losing a lot of patents in the area. Now, this is an interesting development, and for example, as an investor, we could have started questioning Pfizer about this development already here in 2010 when they were overtaken. Now, when we continue to look at the trajectory of these two companies in the area, we see that ultimately Pfizer pulled the plug on the developments in the area in January 2018, almost 10 years after we saw the starting decline of Pfizer. Now for Roche, we see a continuous trend upward, rather flat in the last couple of years, but still a much more positive trend. So what can we take away here is patents can lead us the path into what is going on within the company's R&D departments, how successful are they, and what is a potential impact on future markets. Now that we've established an example in the pharma industry, let's take a look at how regulators have started to use a patent site and the patent asset index in recent M&A decisions. And you mentioned it in the introduction. The European Commission has used the database in the two largest mergers in the chemical history, the Bayer-Monsanto and the Dow-DuPont mergers in recent years. And the patent asset index played a fundamental role in the assessment of these mergers. And to give a little bit of background on this new move by the European Commission that actually, according to the Commission, is totally in line with what they've always done. They just went to a new level of detail. They typically look into mergers when they see that product, price, or innovation is at harm after the companies merged. And innovation in particular concerns normally emerge in markets in which the merging parties have strong innovation capabilities and or track records, are facing few rivals, or where barriers to enter in research and development are significant. And that's in particular what happened here. The entry barriers were very high, and there were only very few players, in particular in the area of agrochemistry. And that's also where the Commission made their strongest move with these mergers. They had to divest billions of dollars worth of assets. Now, when I look at this and look at the Bristol-Myers Squibb and Celgene mergers, that's also an area where entry barriers are rather high, where our research and development barriers are significant. Jean, do you think it would be beneficial if we briefly talk about the major finding of the European Commission when they did their analysis of the patents? The case has been very controversial, or very much discussed, I should say, among also lawyers, and even the American Bar Association has provided articles on that. So
sure, if you go, why don't you go ahead and say a little bit about that, and then let's bring Kevin into the conversation.
Yeah. So there were 4 major findings that the European Commission came up with during their patent analysis. And number 1 is Dow and DuPont were particularly strong innovators in the field before the acquisition on the basis of external as well as total citations that these companies' portfolios received. Second, they had a significant combined patent share for the time period that the Commission looked at, in particular areas like active ingredients and crop protection. Third, the patent shares indicate a high level of concentration already pre-merger, with a significant increase after the merger. And fourth, Dow and DuPont were already very close competitors for past innovations based on the best quality patents and the high level of cross citations between the companies. So the European Commission also looked at how intensively were the merging parties intertwined, and how intertwined were they with the others. In general words, the more you're building on a competitor, the more closely you're trying to do something that is very similar to what your competitor is doing. So you're basically trying to run the same race and get the product to the market first, or the patent to the patent office first. So these were the four major findings: strong innovators, significant combined patent share, already high concentration pre-merger, and also very strong interrelation between the merging parties before the merger. And then the fear was this concentration would lead to market dominance in terms of innovation.
Okay, so Kevin, let me bring you in here. When you are when you see this type of thing with big companies in these areas merging, whether it be Dow and DuPont or Monsanto, I mean, they certainly catch headlines, that's for sure. And these are companies that are well known to probably certainly everybody that is in the industry, and anybody that's well read reads the Wall Street Journal and interested in investing. But I mean, from a patent perspective, as somebody who works in the industry, what's the first thing that goes through your mind when you see these mega mergers?
Well, I think it's a little bit different. I'm sitting in Chicago, the situs of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and a lot of the sensitivity a century or so ago about monopolization. And, that really works for commodities, for things like oil. right? OPEC's a perfect example, although we can't do anything about it because they're offshore. Where you would have somebody who could sort of throttle an industry. The problem with when you apply it to pharma, I'll use acid indigestion, which I think a lot of this stuff causes some people. If you think about it, you can think of probably half a dozen compounds that you could take, Prevacid and Prilosec, and there's a few others. And the reason for that is that when it comes to drugs and biologics, you basically have a problem, a disease, and there's many ways of attacking that, many ways of treating it. So nobody is going to get the monopoly on treating disease X as long as there are more than one way to do it. And so I think that looking at this, I understand the Dow and DuPont number because they were both heavily into ag, and putting them together obviously had an increase in competition. But I got to tell you, the biggest competition that pharma companies have is not with each other so much, and I think that Roche and Pfizer showed you that. It's, are you pursuing the right strategy? Are you going to get a molecule that will work, that won't kill people, that will be effective, that can get past regulatory, et cetera, that you can actually make and profitably? Because everybody, I would, if I had slides here, that there's plenty of sort of canonical slides of the funnel, where for every one compound that comes out from a pharma company, there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, of compounds that were tested and addressed, and it's only gotten worse with biologic drugs, which are a lot harder to make, a lot more expensive, and subject to a lot more potential problems because of their complexity, that you'll get an outcome that you didn't want.
So let me see if I'm understanding you and hearing you. I guess a lot of times people who maybe are not in the industry, and maybe this is probably also true specifically of investors who are trying to understand what's going to happen and whether they should be buying into these things or selling, or maybe buying initially, you buy and then sell on the news, or however it is that you're investing. You think of these things as being the same. It's every mega merger is the same mega merger of like-sized companies, and we've seen this before. But what I think I'm hearing you say is that they're not all the same, even if it's companies of like size, because for Dow and DuPont, yes, they were in the same exact area, so that was probably appropriate for competition people to be a little bit more concerned. But in the biopharma space, because there's so many different solutions and so many different avenues to, say, for example, treat Alzheimer's, as the earlier slide said, that it maybe is inappropriate to look at it from a competitive standpoint. Is that?
Well, I think it's not inappropriate so much. I think what normally happens is more companies look for complementarity. That they say, okay, we're really strong in this area, and this other company is really strong in that area. And because one company may have a distribution chain that can complement one another, I think we're really looking in these mergers for companies that are not big ones buying little ones, although that does happen. And typically it happens when you have small startups that have some patent protection on their molecule and some good results in their molecule. But the days of a small biotech company becoming Amgen or Genentech are over, just because of the competition. And I mean global competition. I mean the fact that when those companies started, there were no other biotech companies around, analogously to Microsoft and IBM, for example. And I think that what we're going to see is, with these kind of mergers, is corporate people making decisions about, does this fit? Are the things that we bring to the table going to complement what you bring to the table, and accordingly, is that going to be productive? And I think that really is the what people look at more than, you don't have as much, especially when these big mega mergers, you don't have a bigger company raiding a smaller company. In fact, even when the bigger company acquires the assets of the smaller company, you'll see a lot of times they'll have a deal. They'll have a co-development deal first. because
So
they'll bring the money in to be able to see if the molecule works, which a small company may not have.
so let
Exactly,
me let me ask one more question, Marco, and then I'll get back to you because I when I hear you say that gone are the days that a small biotech company becomes the next Amgen, I wonder is that really true? And what do you mean by that? Is that simply because when you get a small bio company that really hits the home run or grand slam home run, they become so valuable that the big companies are just going to buy them? Or is it that they just can't get the money? There's not enough oxygen in the industry. I mean, what is it that you're trying to say?
I think that back in the early days, biotechnology was an unproven technology, and that people were. I mean, Amgen's home run, if you want to put it that way, was with the erythropoietin. It was EPO, and even then, I think they partnered with Kirin, which was a Japanese company that had. Remember, it was the '80s, so Japan had all the money, and so it was a Japanese company that had partnered with them in the sense of investing, and that was more diversification for them because I don't think Kirin was a big pharma company as much in Japan, although they might have had some presence given the way the Japanese system works. So I think that what I'm saying is that was where it was like it was like the little red hen. Amgen had to do it themselves because people did not necessarily want to buy in so much. Now, 30 years later, with the Human Genome Project and all of the biotech drugs that have come to market and that work, now and the fact that it's harder and harder for pharma companies to all the low-hanging fruit has been plucked, as Richard Epstein has said in one of his books. It's just harder. So it's easier to let the sorting process happen with the small startups. Let those folks do the basic work, a lot of it out of universities, but get to the point, and where the point is depends on the drug, depends on the company, depends on the acquiring company, but let them get to the place where to go to the next level, you need to have the resources and the wherewithal that the bigger company brings.
Okay. I guess I can buy into that because it's just a different marketplace, I guess, and it's different realities and different ways to success, I suppose. And Marco, what were you going to say before?
I was agreeing or chiming in on what Kevin was saying. It's also a way of outsourcing research and development and just look at those small players that develop successfully, that come close to a market-ready product, and then pick them up through acquisition. And we see that with all the big pharma companies. They're basically on a daily basis acquiring companies. And if you look at Johnson & Johnson, they laid a foundation for this acquisition strategy in the 1990s, where they deliberately said, we're going to grow through acquisitions, and they've done hundreds of acquisitions since then. I mean, that is an extreme example, but it's a safer bet for most companies than to just pour billions of dollars every year into research and development for that one or two blockbuster drugs that come around the corner and that are supposed to bring a return on investment, which is a comparably harder or more difficult bet than acquiring a company that has a late stage or already approved drug on the market.
Yeah. Now, I suppose.
I think the risk, James.
Yeah.
Just the risk, right? I mean, and that was exactly right. That how much these things cost in the development pipeline, from even just developing the drug so that you can go get FDA approval, much less actually getting FDA approval. I mean, the estimates vary, and some of them are challenged. But $1 to $4 billion is a number that gets thrown around a lot. And think about the return on investment you need to spend that if only 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 100 drugs gets that far. So there's just a massive investment, and like anything else, you want to. I won't say hedge your bets because that's belittling it a little bit, but you want to try to bet to put that final development dollar into something that has the highest likelihood of being successful.
Yeah, but hedging your bet, while it may sound belittling, is exactly what it really is. And it's not really belittling simply because there really are so many different steps from the point of conception all the way through to getting into the marketplace. And there's so many hurdles, and there's just even the best drugs a lot of times wind up not making over the final hurdle. And you have to be you got to be very conscious with your investment dollar as a company who's trying to take these drugs to market, and that's why we don't like how much these really successful drugs cost. But they're not, you're not just paying for that drug, you're paying for the other 999 that didn't make it. And
All right, do you have time for a brief soapbox from me?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, and it's this. Look, I know these drugs cost a lot. When I first came to Chicago, there was a Crown Books, and their motto was "Books cost too much." And I hear that echo in my head every time that there's a blockbuster drug that costs so much. But what doesn't get factored into that equation is if you take a disease that would prematurely kill people or cause them to be in the hospital or otherwise have to access the healthcare system and put strains on that, and you give them maybe Hep C comes to mind. You give them a drug that cures them. All right, or it lets them live 10 or 20 years. When I was a kid, my dad died 3 months after he was diagnosed as having cancer, because everybody died 3 months after being diagnosed as having cancer, and that doesn't happen today. A lot of that because of biotech drugs. If we think about the productivity of those people who tend to be at the part of their life where they actually know what they're doing and have families and all of that, taking away all of the soft stuff like walking your daughter down the aisle when she gets married and just be really Adam Smith and hard-hearted about it, you're talking about an incredible amount of lost opportunity of people who could not only contribute to the economy, but pay taxes and everything else. And so I think if we just look at this drug costs too much, we lose a lot of the big picture of what having that drug actually gives everybody that benefits us. So, it can't just be, well, how can a drug cost so much? We have to think of it a little bit more broadly. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Well, let me get on my soapbox just for 1 second on that too, because the other thing that people miss is that once the patent expires, that drug can be made and distributed for practically nothing. And there will be a profit for the generic company. But I always tell people that when you feel the absolute worst, when you are the sickest, feeling, and you go to the doctor and the doctor writes a script and you go to the pharmacy, the drugs are the cheapest because those drugs that you're getting have been off patent for so long that you're getting a bottle of 30 pills for $1.50, so, and I'm not talking about, like the diseases, like the horrible diseases that I know some people have, but I'm talking about, like the average person. You go to the doctor and you've got the flu or you've got strep throat or you've got, any number of the types of things that make you feel like, oh my God, I've never felt this bad before, and it's exaggerating a bit probably, but those kinds of I've never felt this bad before colds or sickness that you get, that's when the drugs are the cheapest because they're already off patent. And so we can't lose sight of that as well. And we're probably preaching to the choir here a bit based on the webinar audience that we're talking to. But, this is a very real problem. And it's something that I think we're probably going to want to and have to do a full hour on, because I think you're going to start to see movement in Congress to continue to push for lower drug prices. And I think, and this really does kind of fit with what we're talking about here, because I wouldn't be shocked, Marco, if we started seeing this innovation question pivot to, well, what is this going to do to drug prices?
Yeah, probably, as it's one of the major concerns of regulators: product, price, and innovation.
Yeah. So, but I know you've got a couple more slides here we want to get through, so I'll turn it back over to you, Marco.
Software, actually. So let's take a look into Celgene and BMS and see what these guys are up to. All right.
Sure. Okay, right. We're transitioning to, so now, just so everybody knows, we're now in patent site, the software. to look at the actual portfolios of these two companies that are about to merge. Or the announcement was made that Bristol Myers Squibb is going to try and merge with Celgene. That came out the first week of January.
Yeah, exactly. 75 or 74 billion dollar merger, if you take the total equity value into account. And yeah, to start, basically everyone here on the same page, and we have talked a bit previously now about all the acquisitions that happen in the space. We prepared this little view here to start our analysis, which shows us on the left-hand side what we call the unharmonized landscape, on the right-hand side the harmonized landscape. So in order to show the value that such highly curated database brings to us as participants of this webinar here, we see that if we don't take the acquisitions into account, we would be missing large proportions of many of the players' portfolios that we picked here to look at today. So other companies to compare to BMS and Celgene. In particular, you can see Merck here in the unharmonized versus the harmonized landscape, how it differs, or Pfizer, Novartis, etc. And then just really quickly also again, just how the numbers change when we just look at the patents that are in force and that could be utilized in the market space by these players. And you see that here nicely on the right-hand side where we've broken down into the portfolios into what's active. There you see the green number of patents versus what's inactive. So what is free to use for everyone? What you just talked about, Gene, it's those over-the-counter drugs and or off-patent drugs that are available now very, very cheap. That's all in here in the green. So that's what all these big players have already accomplished for each and every one of us. Now, coming to patent analysis, you see also how the picture changes here, how Pfizer, you would think, has the largest portfolio in the area, but apparently it's Johnson & Johnson as they have the largest in-force portfolio, right? So
yeah,
how does that all translate into our active portfolio size, our average quality of the portfolio, our citation-based metric, and the overall footprint of these players' portfolios, the patent asset index? And that's the competitive landscape that we see before the merger of Bristol Myers Squibb and Celgene. You see Celgene here with a comparably small portfolio, but very high average quality. You see BMS right here, Novartis and Roche leading the pack with a rather large active portfolio size, but also patent asset index. We could also look at this as a development over time. Let me briefly show that because we got the feedback from the past webinars that is something really interesting to the audience. And also for the case at hand here, we see how many of the big pharma players have cut back in their active number of patents, and that has probably multiple reasons with
Wow, that's just could you run through that one more time? And as we run through that,
to watch.
Yeah, I want people to look at Pfizer. Oh, and there you see there's the trail.
Yeah.
Because we keep hearing that Pfizer's in trouble and the pipeline is not good, and this is, I guess, why everybody's saying that.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
just look at that. I mean,
Although I noticed you watch that Pfizer bubble, when it's out here all the way on the right, it has this whatever this competitive impact thing is about 2 or so, and now it's about 4. So you can make the argument, they have fewer patents, but they've kept the good ones. They've kept the ones that really matter. Right?
It is, and that's another thing to point out, right? So the people who are saying that Pfizer doesn't have stuff in the pipeline, well, are they only focusing on the size of the portfolio? Because if you look, the quality of Pfizer's portfolio has gone from around 2.5 to 6 on average, about. So that's
a big jump. Big jump.
That's a huge jump. So maybe they don't have the quite the what is the word I'm looking for? Quite the pipeline that they had in terms of numbers, but it certainly appears as if their quality has gone up. So
And you could see that as a trend for all the players here, that they're focusing on quality. They're, you could say, cost sensitive, so they're more selective in what they file for. They're more selective in what they maintain. And you only see few players that are able to increase in quality and quantity at the same time, like Celgene, AbbVie. Also, Roche did it for a long time. Also, BMS shows a similar trend in reducing overall, but when we go further into some details of this acquisition, we'll see that BMS is also in certain areas able to increase in quality and quantity at the same time.
Okay, that's just very helpful to take a look at that. Eye-opening, really.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, next one, just really quickly, how does the situation change, and particular focus here on this bubble. So here we're depicting the new position of the merged BMS and Celgene portfolio. So they're clearly coming closer now to the top three players. There's only little shift in terms of quantity, as Celgene will only add a little bit over 600 active families to the portfolio, but nonetheless very high quality portfolio. So they add significantly in terms of patent asset index, the overall bubble size here. They add about 5,000 patent asset index. Now, when two companies merge, it is also very interesting to look at what technologies do they bring to the table. So do they complement each other, or do they add something new to each other's portfolio? And here's a comparison of the BMS versus the Celgene portfolio. And we took the IPC here to get a first handle on what the two players own in the respective areas. The first one is basically just dealing with with molecules. It becomes more interesting here with the second one, with the anti-neoplastic agents. This is an area in general for cancer drugs.
When I saw that they were going to be both together, the combined companies were going to be heavily involved in that. I have no idea what that is. I knew I needed help. Kevin, can you tell us what this is in lay terms, so everybody can understand what this means, what the combined company is going to be rather dominant in, really?
Well, I think that, again, it's you target specific, in this case, diseases, and you bring, and an anti-neoplastic agent is just that. It's something that's against neoplasia. Neoplasia is another word for cancer. Okay, and so this is something that would now, a lot of the things, if you think about it, back in the day, anti-neoplastic agents were basically poisons. That was, you think of the type of vincristin and vinblastin and things of that nature. These were things usually plant-derived or derived from a fungus that the organisms produced to kill organisms that predated on them or would take the glucose they needed. And if you gave them to a person, the argument was because the cancer cells were growing so much more quickly than normal cellular turnover in the body, the targeting had to do with that differential, which is one of the reasons why, for example, those drugs were associated with blood component disasters. Thrombocytopenia is what happens when you don't have any platelets. And the reason you don't have any platelets is somebody's given you an anti-cancer drug that has killed all of the rapidly dividing cells that make platelets. And one of the reasons that things like Neulasta and Neupogen were big original products for Amgen is that those stimulated platelet production. So you can see it's kind of a tug of war that you'd get exactly the kind of enough while you were in these treatment regimens. And the treatment regimens couldn't last forever because, anybody who's known somebody with cancer, traditionally treated, they get an infusion of these drugs and then they're sick for 3 days and then they don't get it again for a week or two or more because your body just can't take it. These days, now we've gotten a little bit more targeted. So I think the first one, the most famous one, was Herceptin, which was a drug specific for certain breast cancers. And that's because it was an antibody that was directed specifically toward markers on those cells. So again, we're trying to get more specificity, but that takes a lot more money than isolating some drug from a fungus. And so that's another reason why sometimes pooling resources. One of the things that's not on this chart, it follows from it, but it's not exactly, is it's possible, and I would imagine that Celgene does bring not only molecules to the table, but methods of making them and methods of developing them and methods of purifying them and that sort of technology, which can be very specialized for a particular drug candidate, and yet that's another form of complementarity, not just the complementarity of looking at a particular molecule, but looking at all the ways around it of making it and formulating it and all of that, and getting FDA approval for it, because that's another thing. If somebody is way down the road to getting FDA approval for a molecule, it may make more sense for you to partner with them, whether by merger or otherwise, and pursue that molecule rather than starting from scratch on your own.
See, in that answer, this is a perfect time to ask this question we got from the audience. At what point in time is a collaborative relationship something that you would say is interesting and that interest might occur? And I suppose that answers the question. Like, it depends obviously on the situation, but when you have somebody that is further down the line with an important drug candidate or method, that would be something that you'd have to seriously take a look at.
Well, which is, again, you look at, given the uncertainty, given the cost, given all of this, sometimes it just makes more sense for a company to partner with somebody without naming names. I represented a company a long time ago that was not in the biospace that wanted to do something bio-y. And there was a company out there that they asked us to look into this company and ways they could design around. And the company that I was working for was a really big company. And I said, why don't you just buy them? and then you would have all that technology that you can use. And they didn't want to. And at the end of the day, their foray into this part of the market didn't last that long, in part because I think that the right thing to do would just go out and acquire. You don't think it should just license if they wanted to, but they had enough money, they just could have bought them. Sometimes that's the thing to do, because that way you get that technology. You can either buy it or you can develop it. Sometimes buying it is the economically smart thing to do, which on the flip side will get the drugs to market more quickly because you bring your advantages to the table as well.
Yeah, and then on other times you might want to partner, and a lot of the big pharma companies are partnering with universities to really discover early stage stuff and working with them, because universities are great at asking questions that others don't want to ask because they have funding specifically to do that sort of thing that is not driven specifically by commerce. So they can just take on really interesting questions and problems. And when they start to develop solutions for those problems, whatever they may be, and in the life sciences area, it's usually drugs or treatments of some sort. When they start to show promise, getting a partnership from a bigger company can be tremendously helpful. And those partnerships take on many different levels. Sometimes it's money, a lot of times it's laboratory space, and a lot of times it's lending scientists and help and databases. And then it can grow from there. So there's all different kinds of opportunities and partnerships.
Yeah.
So Mark,
you're not going to get a lot of blue sky research these days outside of academia because it's too expensive. Whereas the blue sky research works in academia because I could give you, if we had a little more time, a half a dozen examples of things that came up out of somebody studying a paramecium or a bacteria or something else that they weren't looking for what they found. But once they found it, they realized, oh, you could adapt this. I'll mention CRISPR, which is everybody that's heard of CRISPR. Regular people have heard of CRISPR. There was a gene-edited baby in China or something. That comes from basically a bacterial immune system. Who knew they had them? But the fact is that wasn't what they were looking for when they found it. They were just smart enough. Jennifer Doudna and Champetier were smart enough to realize, aha, we could actually adapt this to what they're using it for now.
Yeah. So Marco, I know you've got a few more things here you want to show us. So let's go back to
But in general on mergers and acquisitions and what drives them, it's the two main drivers are: one, you want to buy something that strengthens your position in a specific area, or second, you're buying something that you do not have in your portfolio and that you see as a strategic asset for future positioning of the company, right? So apart from that, I guess there's little motivation behind most acquisitions, unless you have too much money as a company and just need to spend it.
Well, you could make an argument. You can make an argument that Samsung has done that with Bioepsis, right? Because Bioepsis is a biosimilar company, and Samsung obviously is not. And yet, I'm sure that diversification is something that benefits them because it puts them in a whole other sector that they never were in before. As an example,
these companies are being, to some extent, like the conglomerates that at the turn of the century, they have their hands in everything.
Yeah.
But
so
we have.
Sorry.
These are cancer drugs we're looking at here now specifically?
Exactly. So, yeah, exactly. So I haven't talked so much about cancer drugs, and also that we saw that there's a big add with the combined portfolios of BMS and Celgene. We simply reran the analysis, the merger analysis that we did for the whole company portfolio, now just here for the anti-neoplastic agent space. And there we see that the merger in that specific case area has an even stronger impact and catapults BMS into the clear number 2 position, whereas before they were just leader of the pack behind Novartis and Roche, with Roche being very much up in front in terms of patent asset index and total portfolio size.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So
now,
Go ahead. I think the next one you have is what about the FTC?
Exactly. So now it becomes more interesting because this is exactly the area where we recently saw an appeal to the FTC and the Department of Justice complaining about the merger and asking the two to look into that merger. And we highlighted parts here of the BMS and Celgene merger, and specifically on current cancer drugs, including Abraxane, Pomalyst, and Revlimid, right? So the parties that raised the concern have specific concerns for these drugs. And now, when we look at
hold on, go back before you hold on. Maybe you're answering the question. Okay, I was going to just ask that question. I think your next slide answers it. So
So here on the left we have the drugs that were requested from the FTC to look in. That's a Revlimid. It's targeting multiple myeloma. Pomalyst, also multiple myeloma targeting, and then Abraxane, which targets the following cancers. And these were the ones from the request. On the right-hand side, we see the late-stage development drugs, those that I talked about in the very beginning, that see the potential, future potential of $15 billion revenues within them. And here again, we highlighted multiple myeloma because that's then the area of analysis where we want to go into last to look at the competitive position.
Well, Marco, let me stop you. Maybe you did mention that during the webinar. I know we talked about it in the green room prior to it. Where does that $15 billion number come from? Could you just refresh our recollection?
That comes from the BMS merger statement to their shareholders, that they see this huge potential for the phase 3 assets in Celgene's portfolio. And here comes the kicker to all of that. For the Celgene shareholders, if all 3 drugs that are in late-stage trials and will be approved, their shares will probably pay out $9 per share. And those drugs are 3 of them are listed here. It's the ozanimod, the BB21 or 2121, and the Liscocel. So there is very much very high expectation from BMS into the payout or payoff of this potential merger.
And that was $15 billion a year moving forward. Yeah.
Yes.
So Celgene, if all continues to go well, this is going to become a very good
Yes.
merger for BMS.
Yes, and no wonder that somebody's raising concerns to the FTC and DOJ about that.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure you say no wonder, because I think we were talking in the green room before that Gilead purchased a company called Kite Pharma a year or so ago. And then I think it was last week or recently, it basically jettisoned and took an $860 million hit to something, whether it's to its bottom line or it's whatever, because they're jettisoning this program. So yeah, it all looks great, but that's the problem. These are all things that when you say that these are drugs in the late stage, I'll mention that two of the drugs, the Revlimid and the Pomalyst, are your classic small molecule drugs, whereas this BB2121 is called a CAR-T. A CAR-T is an educated T cell that you take from the patient, you do some razzle-dazzle and you put it back, and it causes your immune system to attack the tumor specifically. As you might imagine, a lot more complicated and a lot more prone, and whether maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. And so I think that again, you can't say, boy, you can make a lot of money on this, there must be something wrong with it. And I think that people in Congress tend to do that because there's a lot more behind it. That frankly, the other side of that is if they can get this 2121 to market, and all of a sudden people with multiple myeloma, which is relatively intractable as a cancer, all of a sudden start going into remission. Well, what's the value of that? So you have that balance you have to strike.
And it all needs to go through and needs to be approved. I think we all agree on that. It's still a big bet, but with a very high potential.
And on paper, it all looks great, but these things don't happen on paper. And what I always used to explain that was when I was in law school, when I was a kid wet behind the ears, I bought a Pontiac Grand Am Quad 4. And if any of you know anything about cars, you'll know that the Quad 4 was at the time the best, most efficient engine ever drawn on paper, and it stayed that way on paper. And in practice, it only got like 60,000 miles and it fell apart. Mine got 100,000 miles, and I took it to a friend of mine who's a mechanic, and I wanted to fix it up, but he says, no, you need to get rid of this immediately. I've never seen one that had more than 60,000 miles on it. And I was doing all the work myself, and that's the only reason I got 100,000 miles out of it. So what looks good on paper.
Yeah, your story reminds me of something President Eisenhower once said, which was farming is easy if your plow is a pencil and the field's 1,000 miles away. So I think that you get a lot of that in Congress, right?
There really is. So so this looks great on paper, and it would be wonderful if it actually comes through into being for all of us. So you have a slide about myeloma here, I see.
Yeah. Well, let's take a look at myeloma and how that looks in that area. So here we see the post-merger scenario as follows. Bristol Myers, in terms of number of patents, taken the lead. In terms of patent asset index, being a very close second. And you see the previous positions here of Bristol and Celgene before the merger. And they're literally frog leaping here in the area in terms of intellectual property assets.
So this is the one, that if the members of Congress are going to be
they see this, but imagine the time shift that you did. Actually, two things. One, imagine the snapshot of Pfizer with Alzheimer's in 2006, and then what happened thereafter. And then imagine, your snapshot that animation you did that was so impressive. If some of these things don't work, some of these bubbles could be moving, and it's not like the combined companies. They may have a bigger patent portfolio, but I got to tell you, they have lots of big companies that are right on their heels, and which one is going to be successful, is impossible to predict.
Yeah. Right. And when I look at this, and just so you all know, I knew essentially what we're going to talk about, but I didn't want to see all these slides so I could really react to these as we were going through, and I could ask questions as if this was really an interview. When I look at this really and see it, and as it was moving there and seeing all this, I don't think this is going to be a problem, right? I mean, because you see Novartis has got a about the same size, maybe even a bigger portfolio, or a bigger patent index, not a bigger portfolio size. And their quality is higher, and Roche is, got slightly smaller patent index size, a slightly smaller portfolio, about the same level of quality. So you're going to have three major players really all in about the same quadrant fighting this out.
Yeah.
And then you're going to have AbbVie sort of in the middle between them, and then sort of the people that are all three big companies at the tail end, which, with one discovery in a lab could change everything, because Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and Merck, I mean, they're just a couple of weeks away potentially at any given time to being up at the top, because they have the wherewithal and the money to be able to do that if they find the right drug.
Right.
So I look at this, and I mean, if I'm a regulator, I don't see any problems, but I don't do antitrust regulation, and I understand patents, and I understand invention, and I understand what we were just talking about, that on paper, this all looks maybe far more concerning than what it really is. But
yeah, as the fields or the farms or the laboratories we're talking about are 1,000 miles away, right?
Right. Yeah. Now, Marco, we have a quick question here about what is patent index, and I know we went into that a lot in previous webinars, but can you give like a quick summary?
Okay, it's the patent asset index is scientifically developed and scientifically evaluated methodology to assess the relative value of individual patents or patent portfolios, and it relies on two indicators. One is called technology relevance. It's a citation-based metric. The other one is market coverage, a metric which uses gross national income data as a proxy to determine potential market sizes protected by the patent families in question. These two indicators are combined, and out of that we calculate the patent asset index for an individual patent family or an entire patent portfolio.
Yeah. Now, Kevin, we have another question going back to this is from the same person who asked about when would the timing be right when we were talking about acquisitions or, that sort of thing. What would influence that if there were licenses that had already been in place?
Well, there probably are some licenses. I mean, and you always have licenses. I'm not sure I understand the question. Between Bristol Myers and Celgene?
Well, this came up after we were talking about, and I don't know whether it's specifically related to the university technology. And I mean, there's so many different aspects. I mean, what I would say, and maybe you can riff on this after I say this, is when you're looking at early stage technology, if you're going to be licensing it to others, then the ability for a larger entity to come in and acquire it makes it a little bit less attractive, maybe even a lot less attractive, simply because now you've given the right to somebody else to do it. So if you're going to be licensing everybody, then the ability and money that you can generate from sale would go down.
Yeah, but I mean, it's funny because you can't do it totally in a vacuum, because I mean, it depends. If you broadly license, people get platform technologies, and a lot of times what you'll do is a field of use limitation. So when Wharf had the stem cell patents, in the late 90s, they licensed for neurological purposes to Geron. That was a field of use. And so that doesn't matter then if the field of use that you want isn't that field, because you have sort of quasi-exclusive licenses in that sense. If the platform technology is something that everybody can use, you may want to take a non-exclusive license. But in this case, usually if there's a molecule, you're right, you don't you want to be able to have the patents that cover the molecule. That needs to be exclusive, because you can't have somebody else competing with you at such an early stage. And that's the thing. That's not what we're talking about here. With the university, it's such early stage. You're investing time and energy in something that more likely than not, it's not going to work. And so
Right.
you don't want to be competing with somebody else on that. It's when you get enough data that you think it will work. Well, then that's where you get situations like this.
Yeah, and so it's really hard to give a one size fits all answer to that question. But
Yeah.
I think as a general rule, the more that you encumber the asset, generally the less valuable the asset becomes. But that's not across
Everything
the
else.
board, because you're
Yeah.
gonna have to prove the asset, so you're gonna have to give some away at some point to make it attractive. But and methods of making are probably very different than the compound itself, and that sort of thing. So one size doesn't fit all, but as a general rule, encumbering is less attractive. Well, gentlemen, we were at the end of an hour, but I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to wrap up. Kevin, in a sort of lightning round fashion, what's the one thing that you would like listeners to leave this webinar remembering?
Well, I'd like them to remember that when you look at these things, there's always more than meets the eye. And the question you really have to ask is this going to get a life-saving product to market more efficiently? And if the answer is yes, then we can quibble about a lot of things, but that to me seems to be the bottom line, because every time you delay, somebody's out there dying who that may not have to be.
Yeah. Okay, and Marco, what's your final thoughts, please?
Yeah, I'll focus more on the regulators side of things for the final thought. I think we should be noticing the fact that just as we as corporates turn to better and richer sources of information, so will regulators to meet future market demands and future market situations turn to more sophisticated data sources like they did in the Dow-DuPont merger. And in this particular case, to evaluate innovation concerns in the existing and future markets.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. I really appreciate the time, and I appreciate you all spending some time with us here today. And thank you very much. And we look forward to having you join us on another webinar here in the future. And actually, later on this week, on Thursday, we have another LexisNexis sponsored webinar, and then we'll be looking at drafting software patents. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for that one. That will be at noon on February 14th. So we'll look forward to seeing you then.
See you on Valentine's Day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.